Welcome to the show, everyone. This is the K Connection. My name is Scott McElroy. Steve Pogue's here with me, and we've brought our very special friend Sheena Tucker on. And I brought Sheena on to talk about a topic that is very important right now while we're going through everything that we're going through. And first, I want Sheena to just kind of talk about her, a little bit about your experience, who you are, and let everyone know what you do.
I'm Sheena Tucker. I've been working for the last couple years as a full-time therapist. My experiences go everywhere from teaching at a university here in town, Oral Roberts University, as a professor, again doing therapy, pastoring in the church. So I've just kind of been all over the place working with people in all kinds of systems.
And you own your own business, correct?
I do, yes.
What's the name of that business?
It is called Healing Oaks Coaching and Counseling.
Okay, and what do you do with people there?
I do individual therapy, I do marital therapy, family therapy, and everything else around that.
Awesome. And actually, I learned yesterday that she has got herself set up in a tele-video type of way.
Telehealth, yeah. A lot of us as therapists have gone online, and we're just doing therapy right out of our homes right now, and it's all encrypted, so it's very safe to do it online.
Awesome.
Right now, so it's awesome.
That's so cool. Yeah. So what we wanted to kind of discuss today is a perspective, something about perspective. And as we're going through what we're going through with the coronavirus, as we're going through what we're going through in the church, as we're going through what we're going through in our daily lives, that we've got to understand that there's a high-level point of view, which we're going to label that macro. And then there's our personal point of view, which we're going to call micro. And then there's a point in the middle that's called meso. And so Sheena's just going to talk for a few minutes about micro, meso, and macro, and Steve and I are just going to have a conversation with her, and we just invite you into that conversation. And so Sheena, I'm just going to turn it over to you and just kind of start and lead us.
Yeah, very simply, it's just kind of a way of organizing, an organized way of looking at our lives and the way that we interact. And so basically, on a micro level, we're talking about ourselves as individuals, our personal world. And then on a meso level, we're talking about maybe the larger, smaller organizations within which we interact, which might be our church family, our work community, the smaller things, groups of people that we interact with. And on a macro level, that's like the larger systems that we all interact with: business, media, entertainment, government, education, health services.
Right.
And those are the three main spheres that we operate in. And the idea is that we should realize that all of them are interconnected. And when you're looking out of one lens, you can sometimes be so focused, especially from a macro level of your own personal world, that you don't really see how you're connected to all the other levels and how one level is always affecting the other.
Oh, wow. So one of the things that I saw this week was our governmental leaders, and I'm just going to say that across the board, our governmental leaders are speaking really from a macro level. They're seeing something from a macro understanding, something from a government level, and then you have our press, who is really asking questions from a micro understanding and a micro level. And so when the press asks, and it's not like a gotcha question or trying to misunderstand or purposefully misunderstand, I think, but sometimes I believe that they're asking from a micro expression and hearing a macro answer and then interpreting it through a micro filter. So just kind of, either of you kind of talk from that perspective on how we have to really, if we've got what we're doing ourselves in our personal lives, but we've also got this major thing that's happening in our lives on a macro level, and how do we correctly gain perspective about what's going on?
So I'm the less polished of the three, so I'll dive into that one with some unpolished talk. So what that looks like, and it's, we've all been inundated to the point of I can't watch another press conference almost, even though there's good information going out. Excellent point, by the way. Issues are being dealt with at a macro, questions are being asked from a micro. Just a wonderful assessment on that. And what that looks like is with the information we have, and I would, we'll see if we have time, but I'd love to also say there's maybe a higher level of macro to even look at the issues that are being made the front burner issues. Because I think in the bigger picture, there's some other issues that are being negated that will later become bigger issues than they are currently. But we'll come back to that. But in our current, let's just take any press conference, national, local, or state level, you have a trend that they're dealing with, and then you have a question come about, well, what about this individual? And they pull all these anecdotal examples of which we all have, our cousin's neighbor's best friend who's sick at home. We see his picture on Facebook. It's getting retweeted, reposted, and circulated. And so that becomes our worldview. Now, the church is notorious for doing this as long as we've had the ability to inspect ourselves, where we take one issue or one gift mix or one ministry and we make it a global application. Right. We've been doing that historically. And I think the challenge, if I could say it in a different way, for us in this time as people of God, people who hear God, people who are kingdom, is to even come up above what our government in the natural's macro level is and see things from a kingdom perspective.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the real macro, I believe, is kingdom perspective. The real micro is not our local church expression, even though that's what continually gets put forward. And I think the bigger expression, and I'm talking spiritual and natural, I'm kind of going back and forth between the two, so hopefully I don't lose people on that. When all we focus is on when our focus is only on the people we know that know somebody, or the examples that I can read or touch or feel in my own world, it's very difficult, very challenging, and I would even say almost impossible to see the bigger picture, because you don't see the bigger picture just by the reference or touch points that I have right in front of me through whatever medium that might be. Mm-hmm. So it's causing us to not just get askew, but if I can make the comparison to how the church, I believe, has historically missed being aligned with heaven, and many times is we're focusing, it's kind of like the phrase, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. We're focusing on what we see as the biggest need or the main thrust based on our gift mix or our personal passions, and we're missing completely what's going on at a micro or a macro level from a kingdom perspective of what heaven is doing. Similarly, I think in this crisis scenario, people's viewpoints and even their tolerances for higher levels of truth, that's another conversation as well, are being eroded because our focus is on the potential or the existence of suffering, and we're not seeing the potential greater damages that may not be immediate suffering, but the longer term suffering because of the freedoms and the controls that are being manipulated in this season, whether legitimately or not. That's going to have greater consequences, I believe, down the road than the immediate short-term pain that we're feeling with the individual scenarios that we're watching suffering take place.
Well, I really do believe that whichever lens you're looking at, a micro lens, a meso lens, or a macro lens, it's going to really determine the questions that you're asking.
What you see, yeah.
Sure, and if my focus is very much micro, I'm going to be pretty egocentric, thinking about me and how that relates to me.
Me and mine.
And I think, probably a good biblical example would be Joseph, right? And it really wasn't until the latter part of his season that he was able to look back and see what all that was leading up to.
Right.
I mean, there were times when he was in each of those seasons, his micro, when he was in the, being kidnapped, taken to Egypt, and then, his family stuff, and in the meso season when he was working, in Potiphar's house, he's working, in the prison, not working, but, he's a slave there.
Right.
He would have had a lens from that perspective. But it really wasn't until he was now second in command of Pharaoh, he's now catapulted years later into this position, he looks back and he sees the interconnectedness of all the systems.
Right.
So sometimes when we're asking questions, we're asking the wrong question.
I had a mentor, actually I have a mentor, and asking the wrong question is exactly, he would always say that to me. I would ask him a question about something. He goes, "That's the wrong question," and it would be frustrating. It would be completely frustrating because I'm like, "Well, that's the only question that I know to ask. I don't like I'm not." He was, but what he was doing is he was trying to train me and trying to get me to see that there was a bigger picture. And for me, entrepreneurship, that you have to see things from a macro level. And he didn't use that terminology, but I'm using it here. But you have to see things from a big picture. And so he would always say, "You're asking the wrong question." Mm-hmm. And so as I'm watching the press and I'm watching some of the things, and I just kind of look at even our, we've had press conferences on a state level, we've had press conferences on a local, right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma level, and I kind of look at some of the press, and I'm like, "You're asking the wrong question. We're asking the wrong questions," and what's happened is that the microscope
Mm-hmm.
has been placed on these deaths, and the microscope has been placed on what's going on with this virus, but the macro level of pulling in deaths all across, who's dying from heart disease, who's dying from seasonal flu, who's dying from suicide, who's dying from pulmonary embolism or I can't remember the word right now, but aneurysm. There we go. But when you pull, let's remember that we've got to have two perspectives. We've got to understand. We've got to see micro because we're living the micro expression.
Sure.
But we've got to look at the macro expression. I think of Gideon when the Lord was kind of calling him to lead the army, and he didn't really know. He was like, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know how I can do this. What are you telling me to do?" And the Lord, had a macro plan and a macro result for him, but he could only see it in a micro way. And I also think that in Revelations, when it tells us to come up higher, that we've got to come up out of our micro perspective to see the macro perspective of what the kingdom's doing.
So true.
And so when we're looking at what's going on in our personal lives and our lives at large, let's just kind of remember that we've got to ask the right questions. Mm-hmm. And so and also look at ways that we can rearrange our perspective to see the macro, what's going on, and how it relates to us.
Yeah, and sometimes we can even be kind of, swayed into a perspective because we begin asking questions at the level that's given to us. Mm-hmm. But we really have to first come up higher and get an aerial view from where God is sitting.
Absolutely.
And then begin to pray from that level. Then our questions will change. And so we cannot allow anyone to hijack our perspective until we have first gone up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would even say, for leaders especially, so let's deal with it more of a macro even application of this conversation. Leaders cannot lead a macro solution in a crisis time from a micro perspective.
Yeah, that's very true.
So if we just unpack that statement for a minute, as leaders or as those who are called to be influencers for the kingdom, you're going to have to come up higher and see a kingdom perspective in what's going on. If you read through Matthew chapter 24, Jesus does this beautifully. He articulates all of the conditions that the world was facing, that they were on the threshold then, some of that have already been crossed, but also things to come. And certainly Matthew 24 articulates everything that we're experiencing in the world right now. But that wasn't the message. It wasn't the point he was making. He was just saying these things are going to be the backdrop of the end of the age, but here's the real litmus test or the inference of heaven. And it's the last statement where he says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the earth as a witness." And I think that is the inference that we have to take. It is, how does the kingdom move forward and what is heaven's strategy, because God hasn't suddenly been caught off guard by this moment of crisis, real or perceived, and it is real, and there is a perception of crisis where it's not as bad, so it's both. But even in that, if Jesus' ministry in that moment looked like many of what I'm seeing here today, his message would have been how to avoid pestilence, or would have been how to, 10 ways to survive famine and flood. I mean, it would have been all of these other things that are focused on the micro or meso scenarios or conditions leading up to, but none of that was the message for him. The message was that the gospel of the kingdom would go throughout the earth as a sign. So if, as leaders, and so this is where this started, as leaders, we have to be those who are articulating a meso and a micro or a meso and a macro application of the kingdom, and not our micro, I don't want to say obsessions, but personal passions or hot buttons or agendas or things that our cousin or our brother or our sister or our mother are dealing with. Those aren't macro messages, those are micro examples.
Yeah, and remembering that God is in the midst of everything. He is moving, He's working. And again, just to kind of go back to the story of Joseph again, it's at that, from that macro perspective, at that, when time had gone on, that Joseph looks back and says, you meant this for evil.
Yeah.
But God meant this for good. Amen. Because the Lord knew that He was not only going to save the people in Egypt, but He was literally going to save, the Messianic line was at stake.
Right.
There were lots of things. Everything, there were a lot of things that were at stake. And there were reasons why they had to, Joseph had to ride that out, very, very carefully. And not jump ship and not, flip out before the time, because the Lord was using even what was meant to harm for something much larger and greater.
As we've been talking, been thinking about the dream that Pharaoh had about 7 years of good, 7 years of famine. And in the dream, it was very micro. It was happening to him in the dream. But then God gave Joseph the macro meaning to the dream, and that's actually what set him up, because he saw the macro. He saw what God was trying to accomplish, and so it actually put him into a position to become a father to Pharaoh. It put him in position because he heard the micro, he heard what was happening to Pharaoh in the dream, but then he saw God's purpose. And so I think that that's going to go into what I'm gonna say, and I'm going to ask you just a couple of things that people can apply to their personal lives. But I believe that as we're watching things kind of play out over the next couple of weeks, that we really need to be seeing what's happening micro. It's happening to us. It's happening for my wife and I. Our business is completely shut down. So there are things that are happening.
That's a reality
to us. It's a reality that's happening.
We're not negating that.
Right. But if we tap into kingdom and we come up higher, like Revelation, I'm just going to reference that again, like Revelation tells us, if we come up higher, then we can see the macro purpose of what's going on. That God didn't cause this. That God didn't say, I'm going to remove the veil or whatever. But that in the midst of this, just like in Romans, it tells us He turns everything for us. And I think that if we continue to look at a micro perspective, we'll miss the part where God uses it for us. And so I really encourage you that as you're listening to this and just kind of contemplating and just kind of meditating on what's happening to us in real life and in reality, that we're really tapping into what God is wanting to accomplish and what God's wanting to do in this time.
And I think just from a micro perspective, if I do not really come up higher and begin to inquire of the Lord and let Him give me the questions, I can be asking the wrong questions.
Absolutely.
Why is this happening to me? Why is my business not doing well? And we can then succumb to fear.
Absolutely.
Because we're focused on my little world. But if I can rise up through prayer by waiting on the Lord, I can begin to see the larger picture that maybe God is repositioning.
Right.
It's a divine reset. He's causing things to power down so they can be reset. When you
watched our
I
show
sure
from
did.
last
I
week.
saw it, of course. And when you power a system down, there's a little bit of a pause before you plug it back in.
Yeah,
And then
absolutely.
things are kind of, defragged. And so I know in my own business, I have been forced to learn how to recreate my business online as a therapist. I've been doing tutorials, examining different telehealth programs. I've had to do that literally within a week. So, but what's happened, I've now repositioned my business on a whole nother level.
Oh, yeah.
So if I were, in fear, I might maybe not even be able to think creatively.
Right.
But maybe
miss that whole opportunity.
Yeah, but who's to say that maybe a year from now, what I was forced to do in this crisis has literally repositioned me. So again, if we have this micro focus, we succumb to fear. We don't inquire the Lord and say, how do I leverage this time, this situation, this Sabbath that we've been forced into?
Right.
Lord, what are you doing? Lord, what is the question? Lord, I submit even my questions and let you redefine the questions for me.
Absolutely.
So I can get your answer.
Steve, you have any final thoughts?
Final thoughts, and I'm just going to tap on what you said. And Scott brought this point up last week. You can't be in fear and creative. We have, I believe, seriously misunderstood when the Bible talks about the Lord's ability to create and how He creates. We live in a world that focuses on a zero-sum game where if there's 6 pieces and you take 5, I only have 1. But in the kingdom, it doesn't work that way.
He just goes and creates more pieces.
Yeah, he has the ability to make more pieces, and that's the part we need to see. Your career, your livelihood, the industry you're in may completely evaporate and vanish, but it doesn't mean that the kingdom's provision for you has ended. Just like the Lord told Abraham, He said, get up and leave where you're at. Go to the place I'll show you, and there I'll bless you. And I believe that's a word that is going out to many people in this hour, in this moment, to take this not God-created scenario as an opportunity to go to a place the Lord would show you where that has dried up, so that in that new place He can bless you in ways you've never imagined. Because just the loss in one scenario doesn't mean there's a loss in every scenario. And I believe we're going to see some of the greatest kingdom creativity and expansion come out of this time, because everywhere, clearly there's an enemy at work here, and everywhere we see the enemy overplay his hand, we see the kingdom that's on just think of it like a stretch, like a slingshot, that the tension is just getting really taut right now.
Right.
And when there is a release on this, there is going to be a tremendous rebound. I totally believe that.
And think about it, the enemy overplayed his hands when he shipped young Joseph into Egypt.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And what he was doing was positioning.
Yeah, transported him right into
the purposes of God, and literally orchestrated one of the largest food relief programs to that known world.
Oh, yeah.
So he literally was positioning God's servant.
Wow. Awesome. One of the things that you said with Abraham, it says, leave, and go to the place that I'll show you.
Right.
And so that may be the topic for our next discussion.
Not the place you already know.
Not the place you already know. I'm not going to tell you yet. But you've got to get up and leave this place right now.
You can't move a parked car. Get that thing in motion.
You're going to hear it on the road.
Right. So we hope you guys have been encouraged. This is Scott McElroy, Shanae Tucker, Steve Pogue, and this is the K Connection. If you've enjoyed what you've watched here, please share it with your friends and your family on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and you can email the links to anybody as well. So this is the K Connection, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
See ya.
Yeah.